So just a moment, I'm gonna pull up there. So on the motion that this House regrets the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue, Eric, Noam, all good?
Yes, good, yeah.
Thank you. We welcome the Prime Minister to open this debate.
Sure, you can still hear me?
Yep.
Cool. Oh, sorry. It's complaining again. Okay. Every person who is asked to forgive something is by definition a victim. What we want to tell you from opening government is that the norm that tells people that you should aspire to forgive people and that it's a virtue is something that A, prevents people from getting the sort of closure on important instances that they need, and B, one that disproportionately favors people who are already privileged and advantaged at the disfavor of people who genuinely need more support and need more avenue to express the things that have been done to them. I want to clarify a few things before we get started. We should think in this debate about what exactly this norm manifests as, like how is it conveyed in society and what are some of the consequences of it. I think there are a few things that are important. First of all, the notion that forgiveness of a virtue goes above and beyond the notion that you should not, say, pursue a vendetta or let like vengeance or rage consume you if someone has done you wrong. It is like a positive notion that it is like aspirational and a good thing if you can forgive someone above and beyond where someone might still be able to hold some facet of a grudge. And the way that it's reflected in society is very representative of this. We have things like, like to err is human, to forgive divine. It's lauded. We talk about people, there's often a positive cultural pressure on you. You want to preserve the family unit at the sake of not forgiving unto you, because people want to preserve units or structures of organization they care about above and beyond simply letting one person suffering go. And importantly, I think that it tends to work against vulnerable individuals for a very specific reason. Because when there is a norm that you should forgive, it tends to get leveraged in the favor of people who people want to defend or like anyway. That typically tends to be privileged people. Its advantage, say, why won't you forgive me? Or use it being able to leverage that against the powerful. It works fundamentally in the opposite direction because that norm is applied specifically against the people who aren't able to defend themselves, and it's in the defense of people who want an out. I'm going to talk about two things. First of all, why this is bad for individuals, and second of all, some of the immoral outcomes that result. First question I want to ask about individuals is, do we think that people currently do not forgive others where they should? By and large, no. I think there's positive pressure that all of us would have experienced to not make a scene. We would have been told that you should just let it go. It's good for you to move on. And just observing the world around us, I don't think there's an epidemic of people who are pursuing vendettas above and beyond what they need to. So who does this norm actually harm in that context? First of all, it harms people because they feel a positive obligation. In instances where they're not ready to forgive someone, but this norm tells them that you should aspire to that. And maybe they come to the moment where they give a public instance of forgiveness before they would not otherwise be, before they've fully explored their feelings or had the time to reconsider. Because often that pressure, the pressure for that is atemporal with when the moment in time exists where you actually feel forgiveness. And very importantly, often this forgiveness is pressure to come before the fact where all of the details or relevant instances so come to light. So what that means is that maybe after you've got all the full details about who the person who traumatized you was and their behavior in the past, you would not feel they're worthy of forgiveness, or you'd want more pressure to be leveraged against them. Because there's this positive pressure to get that forgiveness out of the way as part of the healing process, that means that you give that instance of forgiveness. And once that is done, it is difficult to unwind it, because often it's associated with public instances of saying I'll shake your hand, I forgive you, it's okay, we move on. And once you've done that, it's less acceptable to go back to it, because people will tell you you're revisiting something you got over, you just need to move past it, you said it was okay, let's go on. I think it would be better if we lived in a world where we did not perceive it to be a virtue. If people came to that organically and of their own nature, it would be a good thing in some instances, but there's not an expectation that we do so. Second of all, I think there is pressure leveraged on vulnerable people for the reason there's an expectation that if you don't forgive, you're doing a bad thing. One of the corollaries of people lauding this sorts of thing is that it's sort of virtuous to not forgive people. It means that you have some deficit, you're not able to get over your problems, or you're particularly spiteful. And this is a particular thing that is easy people who don't want to like for pre-existing reasons, such as minorities, such as women, things that we would have seen play out again and again in, say, the workplace, where they say, she's just a spiteful bitch or something like that, where a man would have been given far more credibility to have those sorts of feelings. And what this necessarily does is it A, hurts people who are victims and people who we should care about in these instances, but B, often forces them to very public displays of forgiveness that often be hurtful for them because they're forced to reconcile with the people who have hurt them and maybe continue to engage in public instances or be around them. For instance, if a family member has abused you or done something bad to you, where you would not otherwise want to do so, because there's this positive pressure to just get over it for the sake of a broader collective unit, and they use the fact that forgiveness is a virtue as a way of leveraging this power. Second of all, I want to note that this means there's pressure not to stand up for yourself. It means that where you would otherwise be more willing to stand up and say, this person deserves to be punished, or they're a bad person, or I want people to acknowledge this, you're more pressured to say, I'm going to forgive them. You view it as something that you personally have to reconcile rather than a problem that they need to be held accountable for this reason. The third thing I think that it's important is that it means that people don't actually... Second point, why this is asymmetrically applied. So I think an important observation is, this is the last thing I wanted to talk about is that it removes the spectrum, the range of things that exist within the realm of forgiveness, right? So forgiveness is by the notion of this not very binary thing. Like you have the moment where you forgive someone and you get over it and then you've cast the water clean, like you move on from that instance. I think that forgiveness and exploring how you feel about a bad thing that is done to you really be a more complicated thing. Maybe you're willing to move past it and you can tolerate them, but you don't want to completely absolve them for the wrong they've done, and you certainly don't want to go to the point where you think, I'm done with that instance. But the notion that it is a virtue and something you should aspire to often encourages people to take this in totality. They say, I have forgiven you, this thing is complete. We'd rather people had more time and granularity to explore the range of things, how they feel about the particular instances. I'll take closing.
Surely if your contention is that forgiveness kind of happens at the right level now, that would be because the norm and the virtue exists and is the status quo.
I don't think that anything I have said pretends that the current level of forgiveness is too much. Most of my arguments are saying that it's far too heavily, especially against disadvantaged people. The second thing I want to talk about is how this is asymmetrically applied. As I have alluded to, any norm that says you should forgive someone or it allows you to put pressure on someone who has been the victim of a particular instance is almost identically going to be leveraged disproportionately against disadvantaged people for the reason that they are A, more likely to have been pressured or had bad things done to them by people who are from a higher position in society, and B, they are less able to fight back against that cultural expectation and pressure as and where it exists. What this means is that this norm, insofar as it exists, becomes cover for people who are more privileged and more powerful to do bad things. It is almost in some respects a fundamental part of the thing that says if a woman has been abused or a bad thing has been done to them by a powerful man, it is part of the narrative that goes into you should forgive this person, especially if they're a family member or someone that is close to you. Now this means that this norm, insofar as it is a tool that can be leveraged in this way, is simply a tool to prevent people from speaking up, getting full credibility and the sort of closure they actually deserve for these instances. And it's cover for people who do bad things. They don't need to regret their actions because they can leverage the fact this person should be willing to forgive them in order to get better stuff. I do not think that people, by and large, absent this norm, would go to war and wage 15-year battles over a wrong done to them 15 years ago. More likely, we would have a world in which people felt more comfortable not having someone who did wrong to them in a public scenario with them, and it would make them more likely to speak out about the things that were done to them. That's what I propose.
Thank you. We now welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'd like to clarify is this is a narrative that we uniformly apply as a state across the board. Obviously, how it is interpreted by people is up for debate, but it is not going to be selectively applied, i.e. we'll try to push it down majorities as much as possible using mainstream media, using education systems as much as we can. With that being said, just a couple of pieces of framing, not necessarily directly with OG, but just to undercut closing. I think this debate is primarily about interpersonal interactions. Any macro argument that closing tries to run is irrelevant because macro perspectives are based on what people want that eventually relate to the state and their decisions. So anything that we talk about is clearly the most important thing in this debate. With that being said, 3 things I'll talk about in my speech. First, why human beings naturally don't want to forgive, and even with the existence of this narrative, the forgiveness is rare. Second, why do we believe this narrative is something that empowers minorities rather than disempowers them? Thirdly, we think that even if minorities get closure from them, that closure is minimal, but the utilitarian harm to them is massive. First, there are three structural reasons why humans naturally don't want to forgive. Number one, they're emotional beings. They have hormones and they over-exaggerate situations in their heads, especially unless someone gives them a counter-narrative or a reality check. Number two, there are societal triggers and especially internal triggers such as memories that continuously remind them of a particular incident the moment that it has passed, and that make sure that it continues to haunt them till the end of their lives. Number three, oftentimes there are powerful people who use these triggers in society in order to gain power. That's why we have hate politics. That's why we have the politics of envy. The reason why they do this is because it's a lot easier to sell hate to people than it is to sell rational discourse, that you often have to compete against all groups equally, whereas hate often guarantees circumventing certain groups in order to gain power. The conclusion is forgiveness is really rare. Evidence of this is the fact that we have tough on crime policies right now, despite this being a virtue, because people want vengeance. People want to get rid of a lot of the frustrations they have in their lives. Evidence of this is the fact that there's a lot that we see due to the rise of the right wing across the world. Therefore, assuming that this narrative is applied, it's applied due to two. Number one, it's applied when there's a certain degree of criteria of compensation met or apology, i.e. someone seeking forgiveness has to really bend down and seek apology and address their guilt in order to get that apology, because it's not something that can naturally be gotten. Secondly, for you to forgive someone, you often don't forget that the incident happened, but you let go of the rage. You let go of the fact that you connect that person to that incident, but often overcome that incident itself and look at the utilitarian perspective of remembering that incident happened but not hating that person for it and using it for utilitarian gain. Why is this very crucial? First, we think human beings are more prone to mistake due to deterministic factors rather than free will. What do I mean by this? Most decisions you make in your life are either by virtue of the societal context you live in, which is if you're born into a poor family or if you're born into, say, a neighborhood in Detroit, you're more likely to join a gang. Number two, it's often due to the arbitrariness of your upbringing, the way in which you're indoctrinated, whether you get a good education, whether or not you have the hormones to control the extent of your rage. Therefore, this is simple. Most of this applies more to minorities. They're more prone to making mistakes that people will want forgiveness for. Number two, the way to judge mistakes is based on morality, i.e. the majority of morality and what is right and what is wrong is also shaped by majorities. So whether or not a minority opts into that is also something up for debate. The conclusion is most people that need forgiveness in society are minorities themselves, not majorities, directly removing the frame of opening government. Why do we think this is important in order for minorities? Number one, we think there's a principal moral perspective here, i.e. unless you ask them to forgive, there's a greater chance of most minorities being excluded from society rather than majorities themselves. Secondly, the utilitarian perspective is you fracture society and tilt it towards those who are privileged. Number one, is if the majority are emotional, you often make them hate identities more than the person themselves, i.e. if they're hated, or if they've faced injustice by one African American, they over-trump the rationality behind that incident because they haven't forgiven it, and they connect that to all African Americans. Number two, they often limit their interactions with these people because they can't forgive them, i.e. there's less incentive for them to include these minorities. Number three, they often use their positions of power to entrench the kinds of privileges they have far more. So the first piece of framing is the people that need forgiveness are those in the minorities, we harm them. Let's say that the people in the majorities do a lot of evil shit and the minorities are the one that forgive. Even in that framing, why do we win? But before that, I'll take closing.
How much wrong do you think minorities do to majorities, and how much control they have over the narrative of virtue of forgiveness?
What I just told you is, number one, minorities do most wrongs based on morality and interpersonal interaction. I don't think anyone cares about the 1700s anymore and colonial past. There's a degree of how much you feel hurt by the fact that you have short time lapse in it. Number two is, even if majorities do hurt, the fact that minorities are excluded allows them to weaponize their emotions, which is part of that analysis anyway. Even if you don't buy these two layers of analysis, thirdly, even if a minority is a victim, not forgiving really doesn't get much. Number one, we think the closure is just minimal. Let's say you have rage, let's say you have anger. All of these are lots of negative emotions that often make you feel like shit. It's not a positive feeling. So whether or not you collectivize and get utilitarian benefit is very circumspect. Even in the best case scenario OG, most social movements take generations to succeed. The fact that they live with this rage and anger forever is a perpetual negative feeling that they never get over. So even if you get something, it's quite minimal, at least from the individual perspective. Secondly, we think that assuming rage and anger collectivize people. This is the worst form of collectivization for social movements. Number one, rage cannot be centralized. The moment you have rage, every single person has their own story and their own sought for vengeance. So you can't collectivize people into achieving one common goal based on the utilitarian memory of it rather than the rage associated with seeking vengeance. Number two, rage often means people do not compromise, which means they want complete compensation for every single incident that happened. So you don't get intersectional collectivization in movements where people of different struggles of different degrees collectivize for a compromised self-interest. Number three, rage can often be misconstrued by majorities. This is because the moment one person is rage or attacking them, that you're saying that they should feel guilt, and you're saying that every single part of the majority is responsible, rather than asking them to feel empathy. The moment they feel attacked, there's a very easy way for the powerful individuals to get away with the political narrative of saying, these people are extremists, these people are terrorists, none of their power is justified and none of what they want is important. Best case examples, Taliban, I think what they want is really interesting. The fact that they're raging about it makes the West literally want to kill them. The fact that Hamas has risen from Palestine removes all the reasons why Palestine deserves their land. And that's how the rage of a particular community can be weaponized by specific groups in order to disempower them. So even if it's a minority, you don't get to win.
Thank you. We now welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello. Let me just get my timer up. And put POI somewhere I can see them. Okay.
Sorry, before you start, am I the only one for whom the volume is a bit low?
Yeah, I can't hear anything either.
Oh, okay. Maybe Matt, you can speak up. I was actually fine, but I think maybe speak up.
Yeah, I couldn't hear anything though. Slightly better, I think.
Now?
Yeah, this is
Who
fine.
knows? Okay. All right. Okay. A few things in this speech. Firstly, I want to highlight one or two very important things I think went unresponded to. Secondly, I'll talk about that counterframe of sort of hate. Then I'll talk about asymmetry. And lastly, I'll talk about the sin of neutrality, because we think the big thing that they missed is what forgiveness actually entails. The expectation that you forgive, they say that this requires contrition. We think the opposite. We think forgiveness reinforces the status quo. We think that is precisely the thing that keeps minorities down. We want change. We don't think the alternative is hate. We think it is progress. So, firstly, important thing that John talks about that I was responding to, which is the general set of arguments as to why this does lead to an overwhelming positive pressure in favor of forgiveness above and beyond that which people would normally want to. Now, they did respond a little bit with the kind of weird biological essentialism stuff, which is like, oh, humans are naturally emotional, have societal triggers, and powerful people want to make them hate. And as pointed out before, we don't think that hate is the corollary to not forgiving. We don't think the alternative to forgiving someone is hating them forever. It's saying, I am not ready to go back or neutrality on you. I think you have done something bad, and I think some meaningful action needs to be taken before I can move past this. The pressure to forgive is one which is absolute. It's just to say that there is a positive virtue in saying, look, maybe something happened, maybe something was bad, we need to get on and move past it. We don't need to reopen those wounds and re-examine who did what, who said what, who did this, what can be done about it. We just want to forgive and move past it for all the reasons that John gave, because there's a positive incentive on third parties. If I'm the company HR board, I don't want to have to do mediation. I don't want to get sued. I just want everyone to just sit in a room and be like, look, we all forgive each other. Do I care if those people deep down have actually forgiven each other? Not necessarily, but I want big public displays of forgiveness so I can move past it and push everything under the rug and not actually change any of my corporate policies that have led to this kind of toxic behavior manifesting in this place, because it's seen as equivocal, because the positive benefit of being someone who has forgiven someone is seen as a form of reparation. Maybe something was bad happened to you, but now you've forgiven them, you get sort of positive feeling of being the person who was forgiven, and therefore everything is treated as good. I also think the last thing on biological essentialism to point out is that like it's just like a very poor reading of basically all apology, which is yes, the inverse, which is that humans have evolved from social animals. There's obviously a giant evolutionary benefit to being able to forgive, to being basically altruistic, which is why humans are able to move past things. Like all animals have this capacity to fight each other and nearly kill each other over food, and then 2 minutes later be friends and mutually groom it anyway. So I don't think that is the corollary. I think the more compelling, that like what they're actually doing is misconstruing a drive to sort of foment hatred with one to not forgive, which I think is entirely opposite, right? The hatred of, for example, illegal immigrants or refugees, no one is being like, forgive the refugees. People are saying, no, you should, treat them with some basic human dignity, because you're creating a fundamentally different set of circumstances to judge these actions or not like, have they done something directly harmful for me? Do I need to forgive them? That's not the issue. It's the illusion of things like competition between these races, between different groups. That's what creates this kind of hatred stuff that they're talking about. And I don't think there is a meaningful like push of forgiveness is what is going to solve all of this stuff. So next, on asymmetry, why is this important? Because their stance, they had a weird stance of like, oh, we support like a state not asymmetrically applying a norm, which is obviously nonsense, because norms are applied by individual people who have biases in the way that they apply them, and it's not a policy debate. The point here is that when they say things like the majority shapes morality and minorities are the ones that need forgiveness, they're missing the point. They're missing the solution. The solution is not to say, well, morality is inherently racist, so I guess we'll just seek forgiveness. No, the solution is to change morality, to change the standards by which we judge people's actions. And even on their own logic, honestly, like just makes no fucking sense, right? They're like, minorities are like the people who need forgiveness. What you want about? Minorities are overwhelmingly the victims of society. Women are overwhelmingly the victims of society. African Americans are overwhelmingly the victims of the entire American project. It is absurd to suggest that these are the people who, in the general sense, need forgiveness. What actually happens here is that when they do have legitimate grievances, when these people say, look, what this government is doing is bad to me, what the police are doing to me is bad, everyone's like, look guys, just forgive and forget. Don't worry about it. It was a mistake. It's fine. You're a woman. Oh, well, just turn the other cheek, just move on. How many microaggressions do people have to tolerate on a daily basis? How many times do women get leered at, touched inappropriately, be the victims of sexual assault, and told to just up and deal with it because that's the morally correct things to do? Don't shake the boat, forgive and forget, and move past them. And it's precisely because these people are overwhelmingly the victims, it's precisely because the other things John said that went unresponded to about we have a perception of who we should forgive. When we see someone who generally is thought of as a nice guy, think about how many terrible debate men who have been accused very publicly of sexual assault, and people are like, oh no, but it's fine because he was in a world's final, so I guess we like him, not naming names. But the point here is that when people have other axes of social credibility, they're able to leverage that to get positive pressure towards being forgiven. This is John's argument that went unresponded to. The end result here is I think minorities are overwhelmingly in the status quo pressured to forgive people even when they don't want to. And they say the impact of being made to forgive when you don't believe it is not that big, which I think, trivializes and diminishes a lot of the PTSD and real trauma that these people suffer, but more meaningfully delegitimizes what they then ask in the future. The other part of John's argument that went unresponded to. If I'm a young woman who is told to forgive and forget when I'm 16 and 17 and don't really understand what happens, and then a few years down the line I'm like, wow, that that actually was sexual assault, now I can't bring it up again to my family because they'll say, hey, you forgave that person, you forgot, you moved past it, why are you bringing up all these old wounds? These are exactly the kind of things that keep minorities down. Lastly then, on the sin of neutrality and why the perception of forgiveness allows unrelated third parties to reinforce the status quo by not investing themselves in this. Before that, POI from closing, got anything? Otherwise opening.
Okay, so the narrative already exists in society, despite that we've given you evidence to believe that some people don't forgive. Presumably that shows that the structural incentives of people are naturally to not forgive. What's to believe whatever you're claiming about these things?
That there are some people who presently don't forgive doesn't mean that there is not an overwhelming bias in favor of forgiveness in society, right? That just makes no sense. Anyway, we also gave you many structural reasons why particular groups of people do have an overemphasis to forgive. So quickly then on the last thing of neutrality. The problem here is that it's very easy when I have the third option of, instead of taking a side in a binary dispute, two of my friends, one man, one woman, the man's been accused of sexual assault, do I have to take meaningful sides on behalf of this action and pressure my male friend to do something better? No, I can take the third option and be like, look guys, I am staying out of it. I am being neutral. I'm not being perceived as apathetic because I have an opinion on the matter, which is that it would be better for everyone to forgive, to move past, which is a convenient thing for me, which allows me to not challenge any of my prejudices and internal beliefs. It doesn't force me to confront difficult situations and to try and take an active stance to do this. It is precisely the kind of thing that, when we abstract it to politics, is why Martin Luther King complains about the issue of the white moderate, because people are able to abstract themselves and say, this is not a thing that matters to me anymore. I can take the moral high ground by telling everyone to forgive each other, and I do not need to change anything about the system. That is what keeps minorities down. Don't accept the system and beg for forgiveness. Try and make meaningful change. Open in government.
Thank you. We now welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay, so first things first, who is in a position to forgive? I think side OG is a bit dismissive when it says, oh, it's, obviously it's the victims are minorities and so on and so forth. I think that completely strawmans what the actual reality is. We are not suggesting that women cause more suffering to men. What we are instead suggesting is that the way society is structured, the way narratives are created, means that the people in power are often more in positions where they consider whether to forgive or not. How so? For instance, when deciding, for example, criminal policies that has extraordinary amount of consequences on African Americans, for example, in the United States, and it affects incarceration rates for them. How it affects is, for example, you may not believe that they deserve forgiveness, but the people, the white middle class, often do believe that it's a matter of whether or not you can forgive the way in which Black people are protesting in order to address their concerns in the first place, right? So overwhelmingly often, the most powerful actors are often in positions whether they consider a question of forgiveness or not. And that is where this narrative is extraordinarily important, because if they are able to say we don't forgive and act out in that sense, then minorities and people who suffer have absolutely no chance of being able to fight the system in the first place. I think that in itself takes down everything opening government has said so far, because they haven't actually dealt with what happens when there's an added incentive structures for the oppressors to then tackle down on minorities even more. But second, then they came up and said, this means that minorities won't speak up, and that's really bad. I just have a lot of responses to this. First of all, I think it's extraordinarily condescending to just say, oh, because these narratives exist, like minorities were oppressed, just forget about what happened to them and never speak up in the first place. And I just don't think that's realistic, in the sense that they themselves then also go on to concede that even if you push this narrative down, that is something that deep within them that does simmer, means that there's an incentive for them to always speak up at some point or the other, which means there's some form of coalition all the while going on. But the third thing to say is that I think they have conflated forgiveness with forgetting, right? And I think this is also something they've forgotten, which is that there's an alternative, the forgiveness narrative does not mean that you also forget, because it's also forgive but not forget, right? That is also a narrative that is coupled with this narrative in the first place, which is that for you to say, I forgive you as a person for what you have done. I forgive you as a community for what you have done, but that does not mean that the redress that is required for the current inequalities goes away, because you can still address current concerns without saying that this person personally needs to be punished in some form or another. You don't need to be vying for revenge in order to seek redress. We think there's a fundamentally different things that opening government has massively conflated in this debate. And the final thing that I really want to point out, the huge conflation that takes them out, because I think they've tried to get away in this debate by talking about how minorities are often suppressed, by talking about, for instance, right, they're told to get up and deal with it, and so on and so forth. I would just like to say and point out that you can't give credit for this argument to opening government. Why? Because this is literally not forgiveness culture. This is the culture of, like, I don't know, like patriarchal, misogynistic, toughen up culture, right? This is not the same as saying, hey, let's forgive that person and then move on, as opposed to when people say, toughen up, you have to take it, this is how the system works. That's not a forgiveness culture that they're talking about, right? So they've conflated another toxic culture and called that forgiveness culture. We don't think that that's necessarily happening. So we don't think minorities are being suppressed, are being told, in fact, not to speak up. And we think even if they were, it is in no way powerful enough to actually stop them from speaking up. In fact, what effectively happens, and I think the more important debate which they missed out on, I will take CG in a while, more important thing they missed out on is how do minorities, when they do speak up, because they overwhelmingly do, how do they affect that change? First, as we already explained, that the oppressor is less likely to cram down on them, which is something they have not actually meaningfully responded to. They just said, no, that's never a situation that occurs. But number two is also about how you approach that, right? So if an oppressor is told that you are not personally accountable, but there's some things for redress to happen, that effectively means they're more likely to listen, because it's on them, that means they can focus on the concerns at hand. They can focus on the current inequality without saying you are racist, you are this, you can never be forgiven, because that means they don't feel personally attacked. And we think that leads to a situation where they're more likely to accommodate the concerns of the oppressed people in the first place in a way that they never do in opening government. I will now take closing government.
So to be clear, minorities are blamed for constructed crimes that they didn't commit. But this norm of forgiveness is not constructed by the same majority. So for some reason, the majority will sing kumbaya and love all of these minorities. That is your case.
Okay, I'm a bit confused about what you said. Like, look, narratives are not consciously formed by a group of elite conspiratorial people pushing down on the minorities. It is formed in a lot of ways that people don't even realize. It's seen in movies, etc., etc. So it's not like, it's formed in a way that's like only exclusively pushed down on minorities. It's in a way that the general society looks and perceives and interprets that, right? Like, I don't know, Zen culture, or whatever people are into at that moment. And we think it has an effect on both sides of the community. And we have explained how both of those communities respond in different ways. And we've explained why this eventually helps minorities. Second, what is the norm? And I think this is where the second thing of opening government comes in, where they try to say that the norm is overwhelmingly that you must always forgive, and that's all and so on, right? Look, there is an overwhelming belief in society that materialism causes unhappiness. Yet society is extraordinarily materialistic. Why do I point this analogy? It is because just because there is a belief doesn't mean that necessarily that is the overwhelming narrative that everyone is being pressured to follow at any point in time. I.e., this forgiveness is a virtue narrative is literally a necessary counterforce to the norms that exist in society that tell people not to forgive in the first place. I think Sajid already talked to you about how forgiveness and hatred of people for what they've done to you, evolutionary wise, has created communities, because that hatred of the other because of what they've done to you and not forgiving them means people are able to form communities. So there's an evolutionary instinct to it. But also in modern society, it is constructed, right? Movies tell you about black and white. There is no gray area in terms of morality. So it's always someone else has wronged you, and it is okay to hate on them because the other person is always the bad guy, right? So it is in that sense that it is constructed into you to hate. What does this mean, right? So forgiveness, by the way, is therefore tied to hate, and you can't believe what DPM said about how it is not. This also means when, for example, you don't forgive other people, you don't forgive immigrants for taking your jobs, this is when the politics is allowed to make you hate. It is when developing countries are able to say, hey, go ahead and vote for me because I took away that person who harmed you, for example, revolutionaries, right? This is when people are able to say, be tough on crime because those black people who committed crimes deserve no sympathy and we must take revenge on them. These are massive harms that happen that opening government never dealt with. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you. Can I just get 30 seconds? I will just plug in my laptop. One sec. Thank you. We now welcome the member of cabinet.
Am I audible? What is the top room at the allegedly most competitive competition this year, RIP Doxbridge World? This was a very underwhelming opening half. Two things in this speech. One, framing. Two, extension. Framing, 3 points. The first point is to just observe the weird deadlock we have at opening half about how forgiveness will apply between majorities and minorities. Opening government sort of says, these minorities, they get screwed over by the majority. This looks like apartheid, and then you're meant to forgive them. Opening equally asserts, these majorities construct what is wrong. Consuming drugs is wrong. And only because we have a norm of forgiveness will we treat these African Americans with some sense of more forgiving attitude than in a counterfactual, why this wasn't a norm. I think both of this is both assertive and lacking in any clear application of how virtues shape psychologies or practical reasoning. And I don't know how you want to divide it. I suspect both of them are just assertive at best. Second point of framing. Opening government, I think, tries to blow up how much impact this debate will have. They tell us our current trend of over-forgiving. We agree with this as a problem. We're just not sure that they solve it either. Why is that? Because even though things aren't virtues, you could still have reasons for over-forgiving. This could mean that there's social awkwardness, and the forgiveness when someone bumps into you on the train means you automatically say sorry to them. This is the kind of over-forgiveness or the harms of over-forgiveness which will probably still exist, whether or not forgiveness is a virtue. And opening government never tells us why those harms are the harms we should be caring about rather than the ones that come specifically from constructions of virtue. The last thing is, I think it's really ironic from leader of opposition to try to close the debate tactically and say we will have no macro harm, and then have an entire opening opposition case that is apparently changing criminal laws, maybe in some countries, or rather if it's a regrets motion, it should have been about how we wouldn't have had these really shitty, messed up laws because we were forgiving people. It was just not clear what they were gaining from these norms of forgiveness in any useful sense. I think with those three pieces of framing out of the way, I want to have very clear lines of analysis. The first one is a slightly messy, but I think really fair extension, analysis extension from opening government, which is, I think opening government tries to go for these like really, really lovely minorities get better impact without, I think, spending enough time explaining to the panel what it means to be a virtue, rather than in John's speech, and I want to quote him, it means there's a positive obligation and you will say, and you will forgive earlier than you should have. That is, I promise, the extent of which they have told us what a construction of a virtue does and how it impacts individual psychology and practical reasoning. Extension within this now. Why is this extension the most important thing over opening government? Because if we prove this, we actually show you why, rather than some weird nebulous over forgiveness being the problem, creation of a virtue has this issue. The first, what is a virtue, you might ask? A virtue is a preeminent reason to action. It means that you would choose to do something, all else being equal, because it is a virtue. So if you think following the law is a virtuous thing, all else being equal, you would follow the law. If you think saying good morning to your parents when you wake up is a virtue, then even if you're having a slightly foul day, unless your parents have literally like tried to assault you, you would still say good morning to them every morning. It's a preeminent reason to act. That means you don't apply or specifically analyze how you should be acting in that individual instance. So, for example, if honesty wasn't a virtue, at every instance, we would reevaluate whether we should be honest, whether we should stay silent and be ambiguous, or whether we should lie. That is why we're happy for having honesty as a virtue, because we think people should always preeminently be telling the truth, all else being equal. What does forgiveness then being a virtue mean? It means you preclude options beyond just the antonym of forgiveness, which OO says is violence or anger, but it means you preclude terminating relationships, precludes not doing anything for now and letting it fester as it is, precludes taking some time to reflect on how you feel and then acting on it. OG, to give them credit, takes out a little bit of this. They say, yeah, you might forgive too early and you shouldn't have. I don't think they explain why it is the nature of a virtue to have this effect on your reasoning. And it's not just because of like moral philosophy says this or practical reasoning terms. It's also just how our psychology is built. It means that when you tell someone like your mate, like, hey, my girlfriend is like sort of trying to cheat on me or pressurizing me to have an open relationship, your mate's like, mate, I think you should forgive her. Like, this is okay. Or if you're having a hard conversation, or if suppose your mate doesn't ever text you, like some friends of mine never reply to my messages, it means I should forgive them as a preeminent way of acting rather than confront them or have hard conversations about it or reach out to my other friends. It means that, and this is what's important about forgiveness. And OG identifies this, so we'll give them the credit. They say, you need to forgive when someone has done something wrong to you. Correct. But you don't tell us then what that means for your psyche at that time. It means you're in a moment of trauma, confusion, ambiguity of what is the next step for you to be taking. And that is why when you have not only a like moral, practical reasoning point, but also a psyche enforcement by a majority narrative, That is what pushes you to then overwhelmingly forgive when you shouldn't have. On our world, we would still have forgiveness. We might still have over forgiveness. We're fine with that. What we rather want is for individuals to make reasoned decisions, to not let forgiveness be what guides their actions when they think all else is equal, but to reflect on how they should be working. This means lovers having harder conversations with each other. This means friends being harder and tougher on each other on what it means to be a good friend, rather than just constantly internalizing this. I think this takes us to a second extension, which is impact of this that opening government didn't say. What are these impacts? Well, I think I've already alluded to some of them. It means that rather than having constant cycles of forgiveness after forgiveness after forgiveness, which would happen anyway, it's having those harder conversations or having more meaningful resolutions, even if it's longer. Or in some cases, escalation and splitting up and fighting. And that's okay. We don't care. It means you have more thought and you're able to autonomize your decision in a way that you wouldn't if this was a virtue. Before I move on to the second impact of this, opening opposition.
All of these asserted benefits in your world still rely on disproving the natural and socially constructed counterforces that we explained to you exist to overwhelmingly not forgive.
Yeah, no, I think this is bullshit. And I think opening government already called you out on it, but I will do it in a better way than they did. Why does opening oppositions like humans are nasty, brutish, and live short lives not true? One, humans are emotions and they're over-exaggerated. That is symmetrical. You might over-exaggerate how much not forgiving someone will affect you and you will forgive them. Two, they have good memories. No, memories suck famously. That is why they wouldn't remember this in such a useful way. Three, they tell us hate is, like they say, people hate naturally. Hate is super hard in interpersonal relationships because even though they've done shitty things to you, they've also done good things to you. That makes it so conflicting on how to resolve it. If you had only framed it, if you yourself had framed it as interpersonal relationships, this societal hate stuff falls out. So and that means all your biological essentialism as the counterfactual to a norm being violence just doesn't stand. What last impact is this? The last impact that we don't think opening government gives us is that this normalizes exploitative behavior. Individuals in a world in which they know there's a norm of forgiveness are more willing to act in ways that they don't impact on others because they know that even without the effort of apologizing or reconciling, they will be more likely to expect a forgiveness from the other individual. Whether that's a minority, majority, it doesn't matter. What is important to notice there is that it normalizes behaviors that we think aren't bad. Virtues have an effect on our psychology and our practical reasoning. We showed you how that happens. That is the most important impact and analysis proud to propose.
Thank you. We now welcome member of opposition.
Almost all of that is either derivative or irrelevant because it is essentially the same claim made at opening government. Opening government says something is a virtue, so you do it very often. It constructs a heuristic, and the only additional step from CG is to say, yeah, it's a preeminent reason. Right, that is opening government's case. You had a few benefits. You're probably not going to win. We're going to do something different. We're going to give you 3 extensions, each of which uniquely win the debate. The first thing I'm going to prove is healing. Opening opposition flag this when they say you can move on. I'm going to give you 4 structural reasons why healing gets better when you have more forgiveness, and specifically forgiveness as a virtue. The first is that you yourself get the proactive decision exercise power in a personal capacity. You, after stripped you of autonomy, are able to exercise that choice, which is freeing and empowering. Second, it is a personal signaling mechanism. Trauma is often something that you're ready to move on from, and thus you are more easily able to access things like counseling when you emotionally say to yourself that you are moving on from this specific thing, and you say that to yourself that is part of your past. Third, it positions yourself as the higher moral being relative to your oppressor. You say to yourself, I am better than that person, I am better than that, I am moving on from this. And fourth, it is an active choice to see goodness in the world, to see reform in the world, which moves on from that instance. So this wins us the opening half clash because opening government says, well, perhaps sometimes you like move on too early. Our claim and our substantive reasons suggest that even if you move on a bit preemptively, that is often better for yourself than the counterfactual. The second thing I want to establish under this extension, the party involved, which is new. 2 reasons why. First, being forgiven is often a shock, counterintuitive. If you did something terrible to someone, it often doesn't make logical sense why they would choose to move on from that. And when you yourself acknowledge that you've made a mistake, but that you can move past it, then it also sends the message to the other person that they can move on from that trauma as well. Second, it removes the torment and anguish which often fuels that behavior and continues to fuel other counterproductive behaviors. And this is not just a debate about terrible assaults. This is also debates about simple acts of guilt like drunk driving, which can often lead to enormous guilt and feed into things like mental illness and substance abuse. Ours is the side that allows you to move on from those specific things. 3 impacts then. First, We make these offenders better people. And the counterfactual is often there would be no forgiveness, more animosity towards them, which fuels those bad behaviors and those bad views. Second, it humanizes the victim on the other side, which means you are more likely to view them as a legitimate actor. And third, as I said, often it is able to move you on from those the immense guilt and the damaging behaviors that resulted thereof. That is our first extension. It, I think, quite neatly wins the opening clash, and hopefully you can see why. Second claim, how does this affect social movements and specifically engaging with opening government's material about the vulnerable? 4 new things here. The first thing is to establish that forgiveness being positioned as a virtue puts more pressure on the virtuous people to act appropriately. So closing government in a POI is correct. Something being virtuous often is constructed, for instance, by Judeo-Christian norms. But notably, the people who historically were constructed as virtuous were necessarily the privileged white men, which meant that there was additional pressure on them to subsume the virtue rather than the opposite way round. That meant that it was overwhelmingly a upward pressure towards privileged people as opposed to the opposite. The second thing to establish is that when they do forgive, minorities now subsume that virtuous space, which leads to a more positive perception of that group. That empowers civil rights movements when they are able to say, in your anglicized Christian, like modern America, we are the team that is, or we are the your virtuous space, which leads to more positive perceptions of them, which generates them the capital to make better decisions moving forward. The third thing to say is that additionally from that, it also contrasts you favorably against the offending party. So when actually actively attacks you and you choose to forgive them, you look better by contrast to them, and it highlights their lack of virtue comparatively. Fourth, when forgiveness is not given, it is now a far, far more powerful condemnation. And this is something opening opposition entirely misses and engages with closing government's case. Because now, when you say that that particular transgression is so incredibly bad that I just cannot forgive despite the fact, and it is virtuous to do so, it actively positions those greatest harms as being particularly salient, and it draws particular attention to those people. So when you say, I'm sorry, as Selma Hayek, I just cannot forgive Harvey Weinstein, that positions far, far more aggression, rage, and condemnation towards him. And that is incredibly important, because the counterfactual is that with a lot more absence of forgiveness, a lot more rage, then the market and the sense of that occurring is far, far, far wider. So there are 4 unique reasons why social movements become better and the vulnerable are assisted on our side. The third thing I'm going to bring you is with respect to conflict and states and how it improves them. But before I do so, I'll take opening government if you have something.
So Brock Turner was given a low sentence for a rape because he was told that he had a promising life ahead of him. It doesn't matter if in theory it is possible for forgiveness to be used productively if the nature of society is to always disproportionately leverage it in bad circumstances to the benefit of people who are already privileged.
Okay, so I think the difficulty with this is it sort of runs entirely into the argument that I've already made. My claim is not that people like Brock Turner don't exist. My claim is not that there are exceptions where that norm is applied poorly. But I've just given you substantive reasons why there are all the inverse forms of that argument, right? For every single instance in the 1950s and 60s where African Americans could subsume the biblical trope of turning the other cheek, that made them look better, which got them social reform. That is more important than Brock Turner. Finally, let's talk about states. The first thing to establish here is that opening opposition tries to frame out the macro. There are 4 reasons why they can't. The first is we provided additional micro analysis. The second is that this unlocks their material if you do believe that it is contingent on their material for larger impacts. The third is that forgiveness operates differently on a larger scale. And the fourth is that they discuss this anyway. So then, why is it that forgiveness is a benefit to states which are either in conflict or post-conflict? The first thing to establish here is that it allows you to accept sector on the other side can change and is malleable in their personality and in their agency. The second reason is it stops the cyclicism of conflict, because when one person wrongs you, you now wrong them back, and you need a circuit breaker for that particular interaction, lest you continuously move within that particular form of transaction. And notably, without that, this team would just have ongoing conflict in areas where people just despise one another. Third, the act of forgiveness positions the first mover as virtuous, and it places pressure on the other party to accept. So when Sadat approaches Menachem for the Camp David Accords, there is pressure on Menachem to accept it because of that first mover advantage, which leads to that circuit breaker. Fourth, there is often deep-seated and long-term anger on a nationwide scale, which is rooted in the immense trauma of your ancestors being slaughtered. It's anger fanned by jingo and propaganda. That means that this isn't just a debate about individual instances of forgiveness. This is a debate about wars ending. This is a debate about human rights being finally recognized. And if you think that is the most important thing in this debate, as you should closing opposition.
Thank you. We now welcome the government whip.
Am I audible?
Yep.
I'm very glad closing opposition has found the remedy to the Afghanistan conflict, the apartheid regime. And it all lies, who knew, in a virtue of forgiveness. You know, the one that is the cause of all of these conflicts, the one that, despite this being a regrets motion, has allowed us to heal. Virtues do not overhaul society. They do not revamp perverse incentives. They don't massively involve people's responses. A virtue is something that allows people to make changes in marginal senses, and that's what we bring you. A lot of other factors act upon all of the things mentioned on the opposition bench. How you act is something that is shaped by your upbringing. How, for example, a minority community acts in a conflict is based on their impoverishment, other considerations. How a majority chooses to label a minority is based on their desire to maintain political power. So they had to show sufficiency. Is overhauling this particular virtue sufficient enough such that they change that? At best, you can note the entire opposition's bench's contribution as marginally increased capacity of minority communities to act, or marginally increasing their capacity to move on. But even still, they don't tell you that's a good thing. We tell you that this debate acts on the margins. In times of trauma, it is the response that you defer to as an individual when you don't know how else to make those decisions. You're told that this is a virtuous act, one that you should engage in when you don't have the capacity to make that calculation, rather than waiting out that trauma and making the correct decision. It means that people exploit you when they know that the penalty for that, or the risk that you're going to respond in a way that is not forgiving, is far lower. It precludes conversations in the interim. It means when natural feelings do boil over after you've forgiven someone, you're seen as bitter, someone who hasn't gotten over it even though you notionally forgave someone. And that means that this is a debate that acts on the margins. And the thing that you can credit us for is that literal contributions are linked inextricably to the virtue of forgiveness itself. You can't attribute it to other norms like hatred, like political power, like majorities having control over narratives. You can link it specifically to people's instinctive responses. That's why we win on a consideration of weight itself. I'm going to do two things, and I don't appreciate the chat the say silly that commentary is. Firstly, I'm going to look at CO and their assertion avenue. Secondly, I'm going to look at OO and their stunning symmetry. Firstly, they tell us, well, when you don't forgive, it becomes a really big deal. Yeah, I agree. The application of this is terrible. It is labeled against Kashmir when they act in retaliation, and their acts are labeled as unforgivable acts. The people who, by the concession of opening opposition, have the most capacity to be able to reform people's behaviors or to title something as unforgivable are those majority communities. And thankfully, CO gives us this analysis, and it's why opening opposition's material does not stand, because instances in which this virtue doesn't act, and those belong to the people who have the capacity to shape it. But secondly, even when you don't forgive, we think it doesn't become a big deal. You become shamed for it, especially when people have less fear of stigma or condemnation, when you have a low amount of power in that discourse and people don't mind shaming you because there's not going to be any repercussions for them. They call you bitter, they call you vindictive, they call you crazy in a way that you don't have the capacity to control. The next thing that they say is, well, the people who receive forgiveness are likely to act in a better way. No, because when they perceive it to be a virtue and they think that it is an obligation that is owed to them, they're far more likely to act in the exploitative ways that Katie tells you about. They're far more likely on the margins to exploit you in a way that's terrible. It's not responsive at all from the closing opposition case. When they know that the deference to forgiveness exists, is far likely to be worse. The next thing that they say is there's increased obligations on people to, on virtuous people to appear virtuous. The classic EPL extension from closing opposition, from opening opposition, moves already says this, but clearly that is not the case in terms of who these people are, because our capacity to interpret what is virtuous is instantiated by the examples, the media, the figures, the Catholic Church provide. And to that extent, it might not be conspiratorial as Moob says, but it is certainly a way that our intuitions are constructed, which means these people don't have an additional obligation to act virtuous. They just set up the metrics by which virtue exists in the first place and excuse away their behavior in a way that most people don't have the capacity to hold account. The last thing that they say is something on minorities become moral arbiters, and that is a good thing because people respect them. I think firstly, I'm going to reject this premise because it requires people relinquishing their moral value as a hegemonic power in a lot of instances. But secondly, no, they shouldn't become moral arbiters. They should fight for their rights and they shouldn't forgive in a lot of instances. That's what we tell you. CO is comprehensively out of this debate. Let's look at OO, stunning symmetry and astonishing overreach. The best claim they say is that there is a proclivity not to forgive, and this is a correction mechanism. And they give some stupid assertive reasons, like there's a carnal instinct not to forgive, and there are bad memories. There's also things like a fear of confrontation, a desire to overcome trauma, to get closure, to reach for forgiveness because you've done it before and it feels good. All of these things are more likely for the reason that individuals, even if they have that carnal instinct, would like to avoid things like confrontation, would have a survival instinct, they would like to avoid conflict to begin with. So on a balance of probabilities, you can't buy all of the assertions. But secondly, it's very unclear that these are corrective, and I'll take OO in a second. OG point out that this acts on different people differently, which means it's unclear that this is a corrective measure on people who are the most privileged to no response from opening opposition.
What you're yet to respond to is the fact that we've already explained, even for utilitarian purposes, the moment you don't forgive, you're more emotional, that can harm social movements for lots of structural reasons that we've given.
Okay. So the tension in their case is the macro-micro stuff. So you get political capital and you're more likely to succumb to rage. That rage occurs anyway in the long run when you forgive too early, and therefore when you realize you've forgiven too early and you become angry, you are seen as disrupting the peace. You're seen as someone that is making sure that past wrongs come back up, as the person that's responsible to relationships and social movements now being disrupted. It is better that people get earlier angry after the wrongdoing happens and their response is immediate, rather than the weaponization of that response by hegemonic actors, by people in interpersonal relationships in ways that are terrible. But where it does act on those minorities is terrible. They are painted as savages. They're painted as people that don't have respect for civil obedience when they didn't agitate for their rights to begin with. Clearly, the majority material in this debate is symmetric. At best, there are very small changes as a result of a bunch of other norms causing most of the impacts in this debate. You have to isolate the impact this has on interpersonal relationships and your responses. We do that in Closing Government. Very proud to stand in Gov.
Thank you. We now welcome Proposition 13.
I'm going to get pretty real. In high school, I was bullied pretty severely. And a few years ago, I reached out to those bullies and I explained to them what they did to me. And I actually told them that I forgive them. That wasn't me not standing up for myself. That was me reasserting my power in that situation. And that provided me an extreme sense of catharsis. And that was actually having the very conversations that CG want us to have in this debate. That is what Seamus explains to you in extension, gets zero response from Arth, and that is why we overwhelmingly win this debate. Look at a few things. I'm going to look at conflicts. I'm going to look at micro interactions, some framing, and then if I get time, the front half of this debate, which I think is far less relevant. Firstly, in terms of conflicts, Sajid makes a weird claim, which is that the macro isn't important, but then gives a confusing reason as to why. Sajid, you should have just tried to have a crack at this material, honestly. Seamus provides quite a lot of explanation as to why we get better post-conflict outcomes when this is a virtue, for a myriad of reasons, including the fact that it signals that change is possible, that the other side can change, that the fact that there's a first mover advantage, and so on and so on. And Arth only mocks this at WIP by saying, oh, we don't solve, the Middle East. Yes, Arth, you are correct. However, this obviously applies at certain margins, like it can obviously act as a bit of a tipping point in terms of situations where there might be existing tensions, or it could just add to and solidify existing narratives around why there ought to be post-conflict resolution, right? And we think this indeed has been successful in the past, such as in situations like Rwanda, but furthermore, the continuation and why we ought not regret it means that it is likely to apply into the future. And that is obviously a massive, massive benefit in this debate. Certainly something that means that those societies are able to heal and move on from extreme acts of violence in a number of situations. So that is a very unique benefit that we win, and I think is still largely standing despite the mocking from our closing government. So with that in mind, I'm going to move to the next claim in this debate, which is the micro-level benefits, because we gave a lot of reasons at Seamus about why this is good for you personally. This obviously directly clashes with opening government's material. And again, note that by saying you can move on, we mechanise explicitly why this is the case. Seamus explains that this gives you personal power because you're saying that I'm the actor in this situation. It signals to yourself that you're ready to move on and put it past you, the fact that you feel morally good about yourself, and it encourages you to have a positive outlook on the world. We have silence in response from closing government. That is insufficient because this, again, it goes to the very metric of the debate, which both government teams seem to care about, which is what is good for people who are being transgressed. The other thing, importantly, is that we tell you why it needs to be a virtue, even though those are often not intuitive to people. Therefore, it needs to be a virtue in order for you to then do that act and co-opt those benefits, right? But you know what? I'll give OG a chance to respond to that if they'd like.
Yeah, sure. So this one line in WHIP, that it's not intuitive to you why forgiving your bullies in high school would be good, is the only reason you've given why people wouldn't have other reasons based on this societal virtue to forgive. Surely people will forgive anyway when it's in their interest. Our entire case is there are many pressures to forgive when it is not in your interest, and that's the problem.
I'm going to get to that stuff later, but in terms of why, I literally just explained that, Matt. The reason you don't necessarily think these benefits apply to you is that it is counterintuitive, right? Like it's really weird to think that forgiving someone who you might make you feel better. That's why it needs to be a virtue. Then you access those benefits, even though you don't think you will. Super obvious, guys. Okay. Responding to CG, because honestly, I'm a bit unclear what their extension is. They spend 2 minutes wasting a definitional explanation of what virtue is, and then they say that this encourages you to have some difficult conversations, and then they talk a bit about minorities. The first observation I have is that the minority stuff is extremely derivative of their opening. In terms of difficult conversations, as I've already explained, we think forgiveness goes hand in hand with those conversations that CG wants, because you say, this is what has happened, I'm unhappy with you, however, I forgive you. And in fact, I think it is easier to have those conversations with people at the point where you're putting yourself out there and saying, yes, it's difficult, but I forgive you. And even if it is a little bit earlier than a person might otherwise think is good, it is unclear why that is always a bad thing if it unlocks the benefits that we provide in this debate. So that's why I think CG is clearly out. Let's look at, though, how this affects the other person. Again, because this clashes directly with a lot of the claims that both governments make about this lets you get away with your behaviour. Seamus explains to you also in extension that this is likely to change behaviour from parties that have oppressed or transgressed. The first is because they're probably going to be less defensive when you approach them because you're kind of giving them, I guess, something that is good. So therefore, they're more likely to introspect rather than be defensive about that situation. Secondly, Seamus tells you that they'll want to earn that forgiveness to some extent. And thirdly, that instances where forgiveness is not given attract additional public scrutiny because it's seen as quite a big deal, right? And the only response ARF gives at WHIP is just to say that, but because this is such a norm, it means there's just no reason for you to, then be introspective. Yes, it is a norm, and yes, people do it more, but I don't think that changes the shock value of, oh shit, I've done something wrong and someone's telling me I've done something wrong, but they're being really nice about it and forgiving me. So I don't think that dynamic changes. OG then just say that, so you're a sexual offender and you say I'm great because that person has forgiven me. I just don't think that's how the norm plays out. I think there's still a recognition about the fact that that person has done a bad thing. So some framing. Why do we be opening opposition? I think we actually mechanize why this is good for you and why this requires action from other parties. Secondly, our arguments aren't predicated on rage being the counterfactual. And third, we add a significant macro argument, which adds a massive benefit to this debate. We also beat both government teams, I think, because we respond to their claims and actually win the very stakeholders that they care about, which is both yourself, which could include minorities and also other parties. But I'll also quickly add, now that I've got some time, the thing about minorities. The first is, I think there's a recognition that forgiveness might be somewhat more difficult for minority groups that have been oppressed in some instances. So I don't think this is as exploitive as they say. Secondly, as Seamus also provides you in extension, because often norms around forgiveness are constructed by majorities, they often are expected to live up to those expectations more once we overwhelmingly win this debate.
Thank you. Please go away for now, and we will call you back in when we are ready to chat.